joining us. This is the 11th in a year-long series of discussions that explore the many facets, challenges, and causes of poverty. Today we will be discussing behavioral economics in poverty. Also, please plan on joining us next month on December 18th at noon when we will be discussing poverty and homelessness among adolescents. For those joining us in the webinar today, following the presentation, there will be time for questions and discussion, and you can ask a question at any time by typing your question into the chat box on your screen. I am so pleased to have Matt and Dan here from Ideas 42. Matthew Darling is a senior associate and behavioral design expert at Ideas 42, a nonprofit that applies cutting-edge behavioral insights to solving complex social problems. His experience across several domains has been crucial in making behavioral economics an applied practice in policy programs. And Dan Connolly is an associate at Ideas 42 as well. His current work focuses on designing and testing behavioral interventions in consumer finance, post-secondary education, and workforce development. Dan holds a BA in economics and psychology from Cornell University. Matthew and Dan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much. We're really excited to be here. So I'll give a little bit more background about Ideas 42, which is the organization we're working at, and then we'll go straight into the content of the presentation. So Ideas 42 is a nonprofit that was founded by a group of visionary academics, Sendemol and Nathan at Harvard, Antoinette Short at MIT, and Eldar Shafir, who I understand is going to be joining you guys up in March from Princeton University, who had this very ambitious goal of taking a lot of academic theories that have been developed over the last several decades in behavioral economics and psychology and anthropology and actually try to apply them to real-world problems in consumer finance, economic opportunity, health, education, and energy consumption. And we're obviously today we're going to be mostly focusing on economic opportunity, but the goal is always to try and help millions of people to really think about how can we actually take this research and apply it to solve the very real and very big problems we have in the real world. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk through three things. I'm going to turn over to my colleague Dan in a minute. He's going to give an introduction to behavioral economics, give a sort of overall background on what behavioral economics is and why it's interesting. Then I'm going to talk a little bit through the psychology of scarcity. This is going to try and connect things a little bit closer, show why behavioral economics is such an important tool for understanding poverty. And then Dan will come back and give a quick discussion of some brief examples of how we would design solutions or design systems for actual human beings in the real world. And then we'll be really happy to take any questions that you have. So I'll turn over to Dan now.
Great. Thanks, Matt, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. So I think, in a discussion of behavioral economics and poverty, it's first most important to explain what behavioral economics is. And the way we think about it is that behavioral economics is a lens through which to view people. And the way that we view people at Ideas 42 is often a little bit different from other approaches. So the way we think about it is that in traditional economics, people are often assumed to be perfectly rational, like Dr. Spock. They have all the information, they sort of emotionlessly examine the menu of options, and then they select and execute the one option that maximizes their utility. If they fail to do something, it must be because they consciously chose not to do it. And sometimes as program designers, we can accidentally take the opposite view. That people are more like Homer Simpson. They don't know anything about anything, they don't care, and they like it that way. But at Ideas 42, we like to find a compromise. We think it's something closer to this. Brad Pitt with a really gross beard, which is to say that we see people as, on average, being pretty sharp, but occasionally making perplexing decisions. And one of the reasons that people's decisions can look perplexing is that we as policymakers just have a different perspective on things. What looks like a rectangle for us might look like a circle for the people we're trying to serve. Where we see an easier process, they see the hassle of learning something new. Where we see greater flexibility, they see more confusing decisions. Where we see a massive back-end overhaul, they don't see anything at all. So let me give you an example of why perspective really matters. And I want to do that by talking about not poverty, but flying aircraft. So in World War II, the Air Force was facing an odd problem. During landing, pilots of the B-17 bomber were retracting the landing gear, that's the wheels that let them touch down on the runway, instead of the wing flaps. Now, the Air Force assumed that this problem must be pilot training. After all, they have this saying that excellent airmen commit no errors. But if that's true, if the real issue was pilot training, there was this additional complication. Pilots with the same training weren't screwing up when they were landing the C-47, which is a different plane. So in 1943, a psychologist named Alphonse Japanis took a look at the problem. And he found that the issue wasn't with the pilots, but actually with the way the cockpit was designed. The yellow arrows, as you can hopefully see here, point to very small switches for the landing gear and the wing flaps. As it turns out, these switches are small, they're nearly identical, and they're next to each other. So as you can imagine, it's a really easy thing to mess up in the busyness of trying to land an airplane. And actually, funnily enough, Japan has fixed this problem by gluing a small rubber wheel to one of the switches and a small fin to the other, which is a really simple solution, but it's only obvious when you know what you're looking for. So let's take it a bit closer to home. We can find similar examples today. So take job training programs. Some of them face this issue where people don't attend the job trainings that they've scheduled. Now, traditionally, we might make some assumptions about why this is happening. People don't want a job, they're lazy, they don't understand the value of the training program, and suggest a solution. They would need to give people more information, or they might suggest that the problem is just unsolvable. You know, if people are lazy, then no amount of program redesign will help people come to these trainings. And these reasons might be true for some people, but I think the behavioral perspective prompts us to look a little deeper. These people scheduled the trainings in the first place, so why don't they go? And there are many factors that might get in the way that have nothing to do with people's knowledge of the program or desire to attend. Maybe it's the wrong time of day, maybe it's too far away, maybe they need to take care of their kids. You know, there's a million situational factors that might come into play. Now, thankfully, you know, being aware of these situational factors can not only help us figure out what the problem is, but can lead us toward a solution. So I'm just going to give you a taste, an overview of how we design things, and then later in the presentation I'll go into a lot more depth. But let's take this example of the goal of getting people to conserve energy and save money. From a purely economic perspective, to lower people's energy consumption, you would just raise the price. And this is one approach, but it's not the only way. What you see here is from OPower, which is a software company that uses social norms to get people to save energy. What they do is they offer online tools or paper printouts that show you how your energy use compares to not only that of all your neighbors, but also your most efficient neighbors. And including this on people's energy bill gets them to reduce energy use by 2 to 3%. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but economic analysis has shown that the 2 to 3% reduction in energy use is the equivalent of raising energy prices between 18 and 34%, which is a huge impact on people's behavior for very little cost. So we think this is a great example of how to use psychological insights to design things that help people carry out their intentions. But I also want to say in this brief high-level overview that we have to be careful about how we apply these solutions. Like everything else, when poorly applied, social norms can totally backfire. So in case you can't see this here, this is a poster in a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And it says 7,000 high school students drop out every school day. That's a stack of desks, 12 Empire State Buildings high. Now, it's clear that this ad recognizes that people are influenced by what others are doing. And it's clear that it's trying to make high school dropout feel like a huge problem. But imagine that you're a high school kid in this neighborhood. And while you're skipping school for the second day in a row, you come across this poster. What does that tell you about dropping out? Thousands of people drop out every day. Seems kind of normal to me. Which is all to say that we just have to be careful with this stuff, especially when we're trying to serve populations that are at high risk for negative outcomes. Okay, so there's the overview of what behavioral economics is. I'll let Matt take you through how the behavioral approach informs our efforts to alleviate poverty, and then I'll return to talk more in depth about the process of designing these solutions.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. So I think, you can sort of say, oh, behavioral economics is really interesting. You can see these examples that Dan sort of highlighted and think about, this importance of thinking about people as being Brad Pitt and not Spock or Homer. And I think the connection between that and poverty is maybe not quite clear. So I think a lot of you are maybe wondering about that right now. And so I'm going to spend this part of the presentation, I'm going to try and just kind of make that connection a little bit more clearer and really sort of spell out why we think this is such a fruitful way and a useful way of thinking about poverty specifically. So I'm going to do that by continuing to take another tangent. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this project that happened shortly, right at the end of World War II, called the Minnesota Starvation Project. And what this was is that people who were conscientious objectors to the war, people who didn't want to serve in the military but did want to contribute at some level to the war effort, volunteered to starve themselves because scientists were trying to figure out what should we do with the millions of people in Europe who are going to be coming out of starvation. Now, what's the best way to take someone who's currently starving and get them back to being healthy? Now, you can imagine, you don't want to do something like give them, 3 triple bacon cheeseburgers and have them go to town on it, but you really want to be very careful about this. So they said, we're going to volunteer this, we're going to figure out what the safest way to get people out of starvation is. Now, there's a lot of really interesting biology and nutrition studies that came out. One of the things I thought was the most interesting is one of the really surprising psychological findings of this. So if you were interviewing these men who are, just not eating or eating very, very low amounts of food for several weeks at a time, and you asked them, what they're thinking about, if you read their diaries, or you just had a conversation with them, all they were thinking about was food. Now, it wasn't just thinking, oh man, I'm so hungry, I just want to eat right now. It actually went a lot deeper than that. They were thinking, oh, what am I going to do after this project's over? You know what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to open a restaurant. Or they would buy a bunch of cookbooks and they'd go and just be reading cookbook recipes. It's sort of basically, and I think this happens to all of us when we're just a little hungry, but it happens even more when you're starving. All of a sudden, that's all that you can think about is that this process of being hungry is just capturing your mind, capturing all of your attentional resources. And the argument I want to be making is that poverty is actually surprisingly like this, that think about things being scarce, that you can think about it both in terms of hunger, but also in terms of poverty. Any sort of scarce resource, you can use this same framework to think about. So the people in the Minnesota experiment are just constantly thinking about hunger, and that's actually making them kind of upset or frustrated because they keep returning to these thoughts. People who are poor are often trying to figure out, where am I going to get some money? And that can have some sort of, paradoxical relations, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. So here's the analogy that I really like to think about. This is something that happens to me all the time. So I'll be working on, I've got some big project that's due pretty soon, and I'm thinking, oh man, there's so much work that I have to do. And there's this interesting thing where, at one level, the more work you have, you start to kind of let things go. Your apartment gets a little bit messier because you're just too busy to clean. And there's this very paradoxical thing that happens afterwards. Is you start saying, well, there's so much work that I have to do right now that really there's no way I can do this. I just need to clean the apartment. I need to just focus all of my energy on doing anything but this actual real work that I have to do. And the argument that we're making is this is actually something that's really, really a common psychology through a lot of domains, that the more, when you're actually at this point where you're incredibly time scarce, like you are when you have just tons of work to be doing, you actually become worse at managing your time. And the argument is that this happens with poverty as well, is that the more money scarce you are, the harder you are trying to get financial resources online, it actually becomes paradoxically harder for you to do that. So let's think about what happens when you're approaching a deadline, think about time scarce. You have this incredible ability to concentrate and focus and actually start to maybe get your work done as the deadline approaches. You might be putting everything off until then, not thinking things through, and then you say, oh, I need to get this proposal in tomorrow, or this deliverable for a client or something like that. And all of a sudden that day is the first day that you're actually able to concentrate. And so there's actually this, incredible upside to focus that I think we're all very familiar with, that, you can become very time scarce and actually start thinking about it in these sorts of terms. But let's talk about like the downside, which I think is a bit less familiar. Thinking about someone who's in poverty or is trying to fit a deadline or is, just really hungry, all of a sudden they're trying to make all these different ends meet. They're juggling a lot. They're trying to figure out how all these things are going to come together. And they're focused so much on this, and then something else happens. So their car breaks down. And they start thinking, well, what am I going to do to get the car repaired? I really need the car to repair so I can go to my job. And often, everything else disappears. Because you're so focused on this immediate problem and you're devoting all of your cognitive energies and all your attentional resources to that, everything else sort of falls away. And it's great for solving this car problem, but it actually means that you're ignoring all the other problems because you're devoting all of your attention to it. So the basic argument is that poverty is this condition of chronic scarcity, that you're constantly in this condition where you're just trying to struggle to make ends meet. You're trying to find different resources. You're trying to allocate your time. And you're just in this condition of poverty, which makes it really, really quite difficult. So just kind of walk back to some of the academic studies that we've done on this. Here's something that we've done on cognitive performance and financial stress. So we're doing this at a mall in New Jersey, and we would ask people a bunch of questions. So they would come up to us, and we'd ask if we could ask them like 5 or 6 questions, and we would see if we could kind of come up with any of differences. And we were doing 2 main things. We were giving 2 groups 2 different types of questions. One got a financially hard question. So we'd say, your car just broke down, and it's going to cost you $1,000 to fix it. What are you going to do to get that money? And we asked some people a different question. Said, your car broke down, and it's going to cost $50 to fix it. What are you going to do to get that money? Now, these are very similar questions, except for this money prime that we're doing. So also we're asking people to start thinking about money and devoting resources, thinking like, oh, if I need to get $1,000, what would I do? Now, if you have a lot of extra money, you might not have to do anything. You might say, oh, well, I'll just take that money out of my savings account, or I'll get that off my credit card. If you really, add a financial edge, it's much, much harder. You have to think, well, I could probably borrow some money from this friend or relative, but I already owe them this money, so maybe I have to go to someone else. It becomes a much more sort of difficult problem. It actually ends up devoting a lot of your cognitive and mental resources into solving it. And what's sort of fascinating is that you can actually measure this directly. So you can go, and what we've done with this is we'd ask people this question, and then we would give them a very simple sort of an intelligence test, which is called Raven's Progressive Matrices, which you can sort of run with any population. It doesn't require you to have really high literacy or anything like that. And we saw this really fascinating result. So think about the difference between the blue lines and the green lines. So we look at people who are above median income in this mall and people who are below median income. Now, if we just ask the above median income people both questions, they're seeing the exact same response. They're saying, oh, well, I need to, find $50 or I need to find $1,000. That's simple. That's something I can do. It's not something that's really taxing them. Now, but something happens really weird when you do it with below median income. All of a sudden, the hard question means that they're going to do worse on a question about an intelligence test that happens later. Now, I want to be really clear about this. This isn't something about people who are below median income being less intelligent. If you look at them when they get the easy prime, they're doing exactly as well. But if something strange happens when you're giving this prime, that all of a sudden they're thinking about money. They're just focusing all of their attention on how do I solve this problem of getting $1,000 to fix my car. And just to kind of give a baseline of this, this is equivalent to about a 13-point drop in IQ that happens because of this prime. Now, what does that mean? That's roughly the equivalent of not having slept for 2 nights before, right? So that's the same sort of drop you'd have from not sleeping for 2 nights. You can get from just asking people a question about money. Now, I don't know about you, but if I haven't slept for 2 nights, I am completely not able to function. And just think about, the stresses of thinking about a budget constantly, trying to return to that is actually just really, really draining on you. And what's worse is it's happening all the time. So I want to talk about a different framework from ours and sort of give an idea of why we think this is really valuable and why this is a really useful approach. So a lot of people, and you might think, oh, there's this culture of poverty, that if you look out in the world and you see people who are poor, maybe making decisions that you're like, oh, that doesn't seem like the right decision. Why aren't you applying for this job? Why aren't you getting these resources put together? Why aren't you budgeting better? And saying, there's this psychological pathology that's very specific to the poor. Or people are poor because they're impatient, or they're not planning, or they're confused. Or there's, these social norms around poverty. And I think that we're really presenting an alternative lens to that we're saying very clearly that this isn't something about the poor. It's something about being poor. It's something about the context of poverty that if any of us are put in a similar context, but which we are often when we're time scarce, we would end up seeing the exact same behaviors come out. So this is something that's a very general principle of all human behavior, but something that you can really see reflected specifically when you're focusing in on populations who happen to be poor at the current point in time. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand back over to Dan, and Dan's going to talk through a little bit about how we can use this framework, how we can use thinking about the psychology of scarcity to think about how we might be redesigning programs and policies.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I think Matt did a really great job of laying out the argument of, for scarcity as a context and not as a culture. What I want to do in this next section is talk about some of the very specific contextual features of the way we design programs that can make life easier or harder. So what you see here is a graph of caloric intake over the month for families that are on food stamps. So many states have policies of providing monthly lump sum payments to families who are on food stamps. And because, this lump sum is dealt in the beginning of the month, as you can see, caloric intake declines over the 4 weeks. Don't get nervous. This graph is calibrated to have week 4 as the baseline. So it's not that they're consuming no calories in week 4. You can see that they're consuming far more calories in the first 3 weeks. So this is fairly unsurprising. But what's interesting is its implications for the rest of life. So what you see here, research has shown is that for students whose families are on the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, there's a 48% rise in bad behavior from week 1 to week 4, 28% more than students whose families are not on the program. And this is the kind of complication and nuance that traditional policy doesn't always anticipate or uncover, that there might be a relationship between the timing of income and the timing of disciplinary incidents in schools. And so we think this is a place where behavioral economics has great potential for good. You could see how even just breaking up benefits into 2 biweekly payments could help improve these behavior issues. So there are a lot of cases, I think, in which institutions and people with good intentions actually make things harder for people who are experiencing chronic scarcity. I can point out a few examples here, but I'm sure you can think of many from your own experiences. So for example, what good is a great child care center if they're closed on the days when parents need them most? The timing of income really matters. What happens when income is poorly aligned with expenses? How do people navigate that difficulty? Even something like public transit. If people are geographically dispersed, they can have a really hard time accessing the resources and programs that might help them climb out of poverty. So as you can see, there's a long list of things to keep in mind, and I want to go into a couple examples. So behavioral scientists have identified some features of the human mind that people often overlook when we're designing policies. And at IDS 42, what we do is we help program designers adjust their programs so that they're designed to work with people as they really are, rather than as we think that they should be. So there are 2 features of the human mind that I'll talk about today. And the first is limited self-control. And when you think about limited self-control, when you think about resisting temptation, how do you help people make the right decisions at the right time? And I think instinctually the first way we think about this is like, how do we buffer people's willpower? How do we help people just say no to bad things? But another way to think about this as program designers is not how do we help people say no to temptation, but how do we help them avoid temptation altogether so that it's not even a struggle? And the second piece is similar, limited attention. So, people have limited attention. There are a lot of things going on in their lives. How do you make important things really salient to them? And again, sort of the first reaction is, how do we help people remember? People need to be good about keeping on track of their calendars and their schedules. How do we help people do that? But another way to approach the problem of limited attention is not to help people remember, but to make actions automatic so they don't have to remember at all. So let me take you through these two examples in more depth. And I want to start by talking about marshmallows. This is a study done by psychologist Walter Mischel. This marshmallow test has gotten a lot of press in the past few years, so you might be familiar with it. But the basic setup is that a researcher tells a child that they can have one marshmallow now, or they can wait for some undefined length of time and have 2 marshmallows when the researcher comes back. After they make sure that the child understands, they exit the room, which leaves the child alone with a single marshmallow. And they can just watch what happens. The kids are really not happy without this. You can see this young gentleman here. He starts off by being a little bit upset. He's struggling. He's crying a little bit. And he tries to think of some strategies that might help him resist temptation. He covers it with his hands so that he isn't forced to look at it. He licks it a little bit so that he can taste it without fully eating the whole marshmallow. And finally, the temptation is just too overwhelming, and he's got to eat the marshmallow. And the thing that's interesting about this is this child here fails to resist temptation. Some children do, but for almost all of them, it's actually a really unpleasant and difficult experience to do so. There's just a lot of negative emotion involved with denying yourself the thing you want. And I'd like to tell you that we outgrow this, but this morning I had a bacon, egg, and cheese from the corner store instead of the yogurt that was sitting in my fridge, so I wouldn't listen to me on that. But the question is, what can we do? How can we help people resist temptation? So this is a product on Kickstarter. It's called the Kitchen Safe. And what it does is it allows people to take control out of their own hands. How it works is that you put your item in the kitchen safe, you close the lid, and you set the timer. Once you set the timer and you press that button on top, the safe locks and just cannot be opened until the timer reaches 0. So it's fairly easy and intuitive. But I also think it's really interesting. So instead of having to fight temptation by looking at the cookies and telling yourself you won't eat them, instead it stops you from having to stop yourself. The choice is just totally out of your hands. And so you can see how this would work with cookies, with spending. You could put your credit card in the safe during an important weekend. With smoking, if you check your cell phone too much, you could put your phone in the safe. And adults struggle with candy too. So certainly loaded up with M&Ms. But the nice thing about this insight about attention, about self-control, and helping people stopping from resisting temptation, is that the insight is portable. So there's this bank in the Philippines wanted to experiment, and so they offered a commitment savings account, which could only be withdrawn after a certain date or after a savings goal was reached. Until then, the savings were simply locked away. And so, people didn't have the option to bail out of saving by withdrawing from the account. And what we found is that average balances among those with those commitment savings accounts increased 82% over the course of a year. So fairly powerful. Okay, so that's self-control. Now I want to talk about limited attention. And I want to start by talking about soup. So researchers did a study where they invited people into the lab to enjoy some delicious tomato soup. Now, half the people did just that. They came in, they sat down in front of a bowl of soup, and they ate however much they wanted. On average, about 155 calories. But the other half of people sat at a much more complicated table. The table, had a bowl on it, but underneath there was this hidden apparatus, so that no matter how much people ate from their soup bowl, the soup bowl would subtly refill over time from a pot underneath. And these people ate about 268 calories on average, so 73% more. Now this is, these people were no more hungry than the control group. They didn't like soup more. But what appears to be going on is that people use their eyes to judge how much they've eaten and not their stomachs. So when you're not paying attention, when there's no visual cue of the soup level in the bowl, to tell you otherwise, it's very easy to miss the signals that tell you to stop eating. So that's the lab. But this is true in the world too. So millions of Americans have to take prescription drugs for chronic conditions. And many people just fail to take their medicine regularly. It's a huge problem, and in fact, some estimates put it at almost $300 billion annually when people don't take their medicine and then suffer complications due to not taking their medicine. But what's interesting is that, in general, people want to take their medicine. They want to be healthy. And a lot of the problems with non-adherence have to do with inattention. You can forget to take your medication daily. You can forget to take it at the right time. You might even forget to take your prescription to the pharmacist to get it refilled. We fully intend to do all of these things, but we just forget. And to go back to Matt's point about scarcity, this problem is definitely going to be magnified for people who are experiencing scarcity. Things like taking your medicine just might not make it into that attentional tunnel. So here's one interesting solution to this problem. It's called the glow cap. So much like your phone is smart, your TV is smart, this is actually, believe it or not, a smart top for your pill bottle. And it actually can do a lot. So the first thing it can do is to remind the user to take the medicine by flashing a light or playing a ringtone on the device. But it also goes oddly a bit further. The glow cap can call the user's phone as a reminder, and it can even automatically order refills from the pharmacy. The most interesting piece of the glow cap's design, I think, is that it can send updates to friends and doctors about how well you've been doing in taking your pills. And now, of course, your friends, your family, and your doctors are the people who are sort of most invested in helping you remember. So I think that's a really powerful and interesting piece of it. But there's also another nice thing about this insight about attention, much like the insight about self-control, is that it's scalable. So one of our founders, Sendhil Mullainathan, partnered with some banks in South America and the Philippines to test whether reminding people to put money in a savings account would help them save more. Is the problem that people want to save but just forget to make these deposits? And it turns out that just texting people, reminding them to contribute to their account, led to a 6% increase in savings, which is pretty good. But one nice thing about testing these solutions we've designed is that in addition to testing whether or not the thing works, you can test which version of the thing works best. So in this case, the research team knew that in general, people were saving up for specific things, maybe school fees for the upcoming school year. And therefore, they often had specific savings targets. So in addition to testing generic reminders, text messages that tell you to put money in the account, they had another treatment where people got texts that reminded them to save, but also reminded them what their savings goal was. And this approach yielded a 16% increase in savings just by changing the content of the message. So hopefully, between self-control and attention, you've gotten a good overview of what it means to design for people. And a couple of the ways that you go from the insight about behavioral psychology in the lab to a real tangible policy change. So to sum up, just before I hand over back to Matt, you heard from me in the beginning about how people are more complicated than we think and why perspective and context matter. Matt took you through the psychology of scarcity and how poverty is a context that makes it harder to make good decisions. And finally, you heard from me again about two particular examples of self-control and limited attention, and how we can design experiences, processes, products, and environments for people as they really are, rather than as we demand that they be. So let me turn it back over to Matt, who's going to talk specifically about some of our current work in poverty alleviation.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. So we've got a project that we're working on right now called Poverty Interrupted. And the basic idea here is that we're going to take these behaviorally informed interventions, so things like what Dan talked about, like reminders or commitment devices, to get around these limited attention or self-control problems, and design interventions based on them. We're going to be taking a two-generation approach. We're going to be trying to do stuff with both families, with young children, and trying to provide these holistic wraparound services to try and really make it so the systems all really work together in a way that really acknowledges that people are always going to be confused a little bit by complexity or more complicated things. So we've got a couple different things. So we're doing this with children mostly aged 0 to 5 because there's just a lot of evidence that the earlier you intercede with people, the better the outcomes are going to be. We're going to try and work with those two generations to try and, because parents and children, their impacts are going to affect each other. and again, the holistic wraparound approach, making sure that workforce development works, but also making things that that doesn't work unless they also have transportation or can get good childcare. And we've been doing this in 2014. We've done a lit review. We've interviewed about 40 experts actually, and most importantly, have been talking with actual low-income parents and children who are, of course, the real experts on any of these issues to make sure that we're fully understanding their perspective and where they're coming from. So if any of you want to go to our website after this, you can actually find an introductory white paper of it, just kind of giving the framework of this. But we'll actually be publishing our more rigorous findings in a white paper that's going to come out very early next year. And then we'll be looking for partners, if anyone's interested, to actually find service providers who are interested in this approach, interested in trying to work with either small changes to their current systems, or trying, maybe being more ambitious and really trying to, come up with entirely new ways of engaging with the populations that we're trying to serve. Work with them to prototype intervention models, and then finally we're going to be testing these via randomized controlled trial. And again, we're always looking to try and make sure that the stuff that we do is based on, the highest quality evidence, because there's just so many things in poverty that, we thought were working and then maybe weren't working as well as we thought they were. And then, of course, we'll be replicating successful interventions at scale. And this is with Poverty Interrupted, which is our specific poverty-focused project. I want to give a quick shout out to some of the other work that I'm doing, because I'm working very closely with the Department of Labor on trying to think about how can we contact people who are long-term unemployed, get them back into the job force. So you can definitely contact me about that as well. But thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate everyone's listening. I'm looking forward to questions. If you want to email me or Dan with any questions after this, you can definitely feel free. Our emails are right there at the title slide. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dan and Matt. That was great. Folks, go ahead and send in your questions. We have a few. The first one, Dan and Matt, I wonder if you would comment on Bridges Out of Poverty. That's Ruby Payne's work. Your approach seems to say that there are no differences between the rich and poor except the fact of scarcity and poverty. Bridges seems to say that there is a culture of poverty. Could you comment on the culture of poverty?
Yeah, so I want to say, so we've done some stuff. I'm pretty familiar with Ruby Payne's work. I wouldn't say necessarily that we're completely against the idea that the rich and the poor are different. And I think that's a really, that's definitely a valuable approach to have. I think when I think about the work that we're doing, I'm thinking about it being more of a different framework for approaching the problem. Now, other people can be doing these other types of work, and it's important to be going and saying, hey, there might be these social norms that are actually quite different from the rich and the poor. But I think it's really compelling to me, and I find it really useful to say, when I look at a decision or something that I see a poor person doing, or I see in the data that poor people are doing, instead of thinking, why are they doing it, why are they different than me, think about why would I do that in those circumstances? If I was in these circumstances, what would cause me to do something like not be actively looking for a job, or not taking training, or not going and using like the child care system? And they're frameworks for trying to think about this. They're frameworks for trying to answer questions, but I wouldn't say they're the answer. So if someone says, oh, do you think that poor people and rich people are identical? I'd say, of course not. But I think that I think it's a very powerful framework to say that to start from it and say, okay, this is not about poor people. This is about human behavior, but it's things that are very in common. And again, this is a framework, and this is how we interrogate things, and this is how we think about them. But it's not a explicit, argument that there isn't definitely no culture poverty. So it's more that we're saying this is an alternative way of thinking about it that we find to be very fruitful.
Yeah, just to elaborate a little bit more on that, one of the things I've encountered in my work is the understanding that all humans face issues of scarcity and limited attention, but for people in low-income populations, especially, the risk is just much higher. So, for example, one of my projects is with the Community College of Philadelphia. issue we're working on is that students plan their schedule in such a way, that between work and classes and study time and family obligations, they're just way overbooked. Just can't manage to do well in school because their time is so constrained. Now, I'm guilty of doing the same thing. I overcommit myself all the time. I agree to things and then find that it's actually a real constraint on my time and well-being. But for me, the consequences are lower. I have to cancel plans. I have to move some things around. For these students, the consequences might be failing a class that drops them off financially. And that's a real issue that affects their ability to complete their degree and move forward. And so, one of the things we think about a lot is not just, how does scarcity impact decisions in the moment, but what do those decisions mean for ultimate outcomes?
Thank you. Another question. Does this have to do with the bandwidth tax? Can you talk about what that means?
Yeah, of course. So, think about with the bandwidth tax, I think about any time that we're imposing something on people, we're actually taxing their bandwidth. Let me give you an example. Like, a lot of anti-poverty programs might be, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through to get to the benefits that you're trying to get. So you think about someone trying to get on SNAP or trying to get on TANF. And to some extent, those hoops are sort of there with the mental model of the policymakers might have been like, the people who really, really need TANF or really, really need access to SNAP are going to be the people who are going to be willing to jump through these hoops. But actually, the framework that we have is saying, well, maybe that's not really true, that the people who really are the most sort of constrained on their time or, their needs are actually the ones that are hardest hit by these bandwidth taxes. So a good example of this might be, and I'm drawing a bit from the education stuff like Dan did, but think about applying for a FAFSA loan. Now, it's not that hard to do. It's something where you basically do have to go and take 2 or 3 hours at most, hopefully, to kind of go through your taxes and figure out exactly how the loans can get through. And it's interesting, that's actually quite hard for someone who is constantly trying to fight fires and manage a really difficult budget or a really difficult time schedule to do. And it's actually much easier to do if you're someone who has a lot of slack in your schedule. So thinking about, what are we doing that is imposing these like cognitive burdens or bandwidth tax on people, and a lot of times those are missing. We know, if someone said, oh, let's charge poor people, $50 to do something, that if you wanted to apply for TANF, that was going to cost you $50. We sort of instinctually understand exactly why that's a bad idea, but saying, oh, if you're going to apply for this, you're going to have to take 3 hours out of your day to kind of track down all of your finances and figure that out. That's not, I think, really as clear. So thinking about, how can we make sure that these bandwidth taxes or, trying to, that are imposing these really heavy cognitive burdens on the poor specifically, how can we minimize those in society?
Thank you. We have a comment that we hope you can comment on. It has been very interesting to watch interviews of people who lost housing in the recession. They turn into poor people with reduced capacity really, really fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great comment. And we did a lot of work on this at the time. This is one of the work that I thought was really interesting. One thing we were working with banks on this, and banks were desperately trying to get people to renegotiate their mortgage terms, because for the bank, if you are defaulting on your house, the bank's losing a lot of money on that. So they're really, really happy to cut you a deal. They cost like $50,000 in processing fees for them every time. And so the banks were desperately mailing people saying, please, please, please give us a call or respond to us or do anything, because we want you to keep you in your house. We don't want you to lose your house. So we'll suspend payments for a year or reduce them by half for 2 years or something like that. And what was funny is that people, if you're like, oh, I'm in danger of losing my house, the last thing you want to do is open a letter from the bank, because it's probably bad news. And so we heard all these stories about people who would come in and they, once they sort of finally hit the realization that they were really in trouble, and they would come into the bank and they would bring in, and like we heard this from several different sources, but they would bring in like a trash bag full of unopened mail from the bank. They just couldn't even handle the act of opening it. And so we actually worked very closely with the banks on like how could they even just like redesign their communications just to make it friendlier or not as intimidating. But I think that's a really good point. And again, it's something that is not driven by the person or these like personal capacities, but something that's driven by the situation that you're in.
Doesn't that, how people can so quickly with economic fluctuations fall into poverty, doesn't that fly in the face of the first question around the culture of poverty? How do you reconcile the two? A culture seems to me to say that it's ingrained, it's there, it's over the course of many years or even generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, to go to my earlier response, like I think it's more about the framework that you're using to approach it, right? So again, like I think our framework, like I said, like I think it does a really good job of explaining that exactly, like why you might see these behaviors change drastically as someone has this sort of hit with this shock to the system. And then, the culture poor, I think we can explain that too, but there are examples of multi-generational poverty, and we don't really know exactly, to what extent those are being caused by the framework that we're using, where it's saying, here's, it's about cognitive burden, it's about this excessive bandwidth tax. But there's also, I think there's plenty of room for thinking about it from that sort of more cultural lens, and thinking about how does, how if you're someone who's living, for example, like in an inner city, and you really do want to, get out of that by getting an education or something, there's actually like a lot of social pressure for you to not do that. And I think that, these definitely exist. And I'm definitely not arguing that, like, the culture poverty doesn't exist at all. But I'm thinking that, we might be overutilizing it relative to this newer framework. And a lot of the phenomena that we used to rely on that, I think, are well explained. But I'm not saying that, this is, I wouldn't say that we've got a silver bullet that explains all of poverty. I think we have a useful framework that has been relatively unexplored until now.
Yeah, and I want to return to something that Matt touched on, which is something that I think is a really powerful intersection between the ideas of the cultural poverty and poverty as context, which is the idea of social norms. So we know that people are profoundly affected by what they observe and perceive other people to be doing. So you can see how the logic model might be, scarcity governs some behavior, like not going to college, for example, where there are all these process steps that lead people to be unable to go to college, and because poverty as context has limited people's ability to attend for the secondary ed, you can see how that becomes a norm. And other people in the community perceive their friends and family not going to college and assume that that must be the correct behavior, the desired behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can think about this, like, think about, when people are thinking about jobs or something like that. Like, what I want people to be doing is, going onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and researching, possible career paths and seeing, what's out there. People aren't going to do that. We know people aren't going to do that. But what they are going to do is they're going to talk to friends and family. They're going to see, who's successful in my community. And that, if you're in a community where you don't have maybe like those positive role models, it's going to be much harder to figure out how to get that pathway out of poverty. So I think there's a lot of interesting relationships between the two frameworks.
Thank you. This next question kind of comes from, this is where the rubber meets the road, right? We've developed a lot of programs that ask for personal responsibility, welfare reform under Clinton, for instance. So the question is, and a lot of our workers are facing this in our TANF and SNAP programs, how do we help people move out of poverty, understanding the notions of scarcity and limited bandwidth while not being an enabler? I want people to take the initiative and believe in personal responsibility, but still want to keep in mind why people are doing what they do.
That's a great question. I think somebody said, this is a question that we're struggling with all the time. But I mean, you can think about some things, some of the aspects of welfare reform. So, for example, think about like the way that a lot of services are time limited, right? So, TANF, I think you can have up to 5 years. And I think about this, like, are people actually thinking about, like, oh, if I'm on TANF this month, that means that my total stock of 60 months of TANF are being drawn down over time. I don't think that they are. I don't think I would think about it that way. That's like 60 months is a long period of time, and if you're in, if you're in something where you're in a desperate case right now, you're not going to be thinking about it in that sort of like very long term because you're saying, well, I need this money right now because of these desperate situations, and then at the end of that period, which you might not even realize is there because you're not keeping track of it. If you get kicked off the TANF roll, you're actually, you're left without like a good recompense. So I think, we're definitely working on this. I think there's ways you could think about trying to redesign these things because I think you're right. There's the element of like the welfare reform stuff that makes a lot of sense, and you do want to make sure that, we are making systems that make it easier for you to work hard and get ahead. And I think, there's some elements where you say, oh, maybe this makes it harder in a surprising way. Or even, thinking about, do people, I don't understand how my taxes work. I'm an economist. And then thinking when we try and incentivize people via the EITC, how is that actually communicated? And you think about how many people, don't file taxes even though they'd actually get a substantial refund from the EITC, and how can we kind of market that and get that information out there? I mean, I don't have a pat answer to this. These are questions that we're struggling with, and these are things that we're looking to test in Poverty Interrupted and several other programs.
That seems.
Yeah, I want to return.
Sorry,
that seems. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, I wanted to return to something in the question, which is about being an enabler, and I think that's a totally valid concern. For something like TANF or financial aid, and again, I apologize that all of my examples are going to be about post-secondary ed, and that's where my work has been over the past couple of months. But something, something where there's a benefit with a defined time limit. And, I don't think people are wrong in providing some incentive to get off the program by making it time limited. Which is to say that I don't think the answer is to make these benefits unlimited and enable just using them. But I think there's a lot of work to be done using the principle of behavioral design to make those incentives sort of more tangible, more relevant up front so that people are aware of them and aren't surprised at the end when they're all of a sudden gone.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, you just think about, again, like the TANF timeline, like how do you communicate clearly what these trade-offs are and help people make the decision, oh, should I be using TANF? Should I be using these things? And trying to better communicate currently existing programs. I think that would be a huge, huge improvement.
Thank you. I think the context for this next question may be a lot of the work you've been doing is under manipulation in the lab. I'm just talking not about your work particularly, but behavioral economics, and our understanding is that you're moving away to a more practical application of this. But this question asks, with something like the marshmallow experiment, what role does the subject's previous experience play? I'm thinking of kids who may have learned not to trust what an adult says and so might well doubt 2 marshmallows will be the reward for delaying instant gratification. It's a great question for practical application to what you see in the lab under experimental conditions as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think whoever asked that must have read the paper, because there's a paper that actually makes that direct argument.
Yeah.
So either they either read the paper or I'm really impressed by the intuition. No, I think that's completely right. Is that imagine being a child who is used to adults promising that you'll get 2 marshmallows and then not coming back with a second marshmallow. Of course you're not going, if you have 1 marshmallow right now, of course you're going to eat it. If your sort of experience of the world is that people make promises and they're not kept, like, then, carpe diem. And so I think both of those elements are there. I mean, and I can't remember the name of that, but like someone did do the study and they did see like there was, a substantial amount of that was based on that exact difference about children who sort of had expectations about how adults would behave towards them. And I think that's valid. But at the same time, I think we've all experienced being in our own marshmallow experiments, right? That I know that that temptations hit me every single day. I know that I struggle to do my work and not goof off. I struggle to keep to my diet. I struggle to make sure I'm sleeping right. And I think we all sort of experience them. And so like the example of what is the marshmallow test for you, where there's something that it is sitting in front of you and you're really tempted by, and it does sort of occupy your attention. It's so hard to think about something. If you're trying to keep a diet and your coworkers say, oh, we're going to have a party and there's going to be cake at that party, and you can go there with every intention of not eating any cake, and you are going to eat the cake. So I think the marshmallow experiment, I think, is a cute example, and it may be I need to read those studies a little bit further. Maybe it's not exactly, but there's been a lot of similar replications of this this insight of it, of self-control as a limited resource that is something that gets drained by the act of exercising it, which I think is really important, and really is very contradictory to some of the ways that we might normally think about self-control. There's a lot of sort of pseudo-Victorian imagining where self-control is something that you build up by working at it, and it gets stronger over time. And that might be true, but there's also this sort of, in the short term, you use up your self-control, and if you, concentrate all your energy on one thing, you're not actually going to have it for something else.
Thank you so much. We're running short on time. Another question. I think this comes from somebody in our weatherization program, and maybe you could talk about the effects of coaching, perhaps, generally and specifically. But this question is, so how can we best reach out to low-income people with high electric bills to offer them free assistance along with appliances, heat pumps, and other things, when many won't even respond to the offer for this help? It's like the EITC slow or low take-up that you mentioned. How can we get people, when we have these programs and we have these incentives, to take advantage of them?
There's a great program that's exactly this, doing weatherization. So this is based on the United Kingdom. It's a very similar group to us. It's called the Behavioral Insights Team. And they were doing exactly this problem. They were trying to get people to weatherize their houses, and people weren't willing to do it, or they weren't responding to these requests. And they were doing a bunch of stuff to try and do this. They were even giving people incentives. So they're saying, hey, we'll give you, $50 off. Here's what actually ended up working, which I thought was incredibly clever. They gave people a voucher for like attic cleaning services. Because what it turns out, it wasn't that people didn't want to weatherize their homes. People want to weatherize their homes, but they were confronted with the idea of cleaning their attic so that someone could go up and like weatherize the attic. And we're just like, oh my gosh, I can't let someone see how filthy my attic is and how stuck with things it is. And so I need to do that, and once I've done that, I will then weatherize my house. Now, as anyone who's ever said, oh, I need to really clean out my attic or my basement or anything like that, it's something that you can procrastinate on for decades. And so by getting, it was really funny because they gave an equivalent voucher for money, no effect, but the same financial resources for that devoted specifically to weatherizing the house, or to getting that attic cleaned, actually increased take-up of weatherization services by a ton. So I think that's an example of that. I'm not saying necessarily do exactly that, but it's something where it's like the bottleneck for that can sometimes be something that you're just not expecting. So you might be, the populations that you're trying to serve very well might have every intention of weatherizing their house, but it's something that maybe is not, you're not going to do it this year, or they're planning to do it next year. So just thinking about like what are maybe these very small hassles, like spending an hour tidying your attic, that might be in the way.
Yeah, and I think Matt's example speaks to this broader point of figuring out exactly where the bottleneck lies. Right? It could be that people aren't getting the communications at all. It could be that they're getting them and not really paying attention to them. They might get it, open it, intend to do it, and fail to follow through. And so I think even something simple as getting out there and talking to the population you're trying to serve and figuring out, what their perception of these services are, like their awareness, and understanding where exactly the failure point is. For example, it could be attic cleaning, is a really powerful tool.
So this is going to be the last question. We'll probably go a minute over, but I think it's an important one. And I feel the question is, I feel like all this emphasis on influencing behavior change ignores the fact that poverty is a real economic, structural, and systematic issue. How do you integrate those two perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I would say that there are these huge issues that you need to deal with, and that we really, as a society, need to be thinking about and working towards. And and some of these things are things that are under our control, and some of the things aren't. And I think the way that I think about the framework that we're using is, I'm not going to say ignore the structural and issues that are going on. There's huge, thinking about the way that policy and technology has changed in the last 30 years and how that's driving inequality, how that's really reducing, median wage for male earners, essentially. I mean, those are big issues, and they're big issues to tackle. And I think, I'm not saying we shouldn't be tackling them. And I think, what I would say is that there still is some, what we're mostly looking at is some low-hanging fruit that might not have been explored yet. That we can say, there are these huge structural impediments that we do need to figure out, and we do, as a society, need to put effort on. And we were talking about this at the beginning of the call, that this was inspired by the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. And there's tons of great work that's being done specifically on these issues. And I think we're trying to supplement that work. We're definitely not trying to replace it. We're definitely not saying it's not needed, but saying, there's also these other problems that we can solve that can make things better, even given maybe these other structural impediments. So, you can think about, you can think about your 20-year, or 30-year goal, which is a complete, reform of how, welfare or TANF or anything like that works, and that's really valuable. But we're also going to say, hey, here's how the TANF program or this other program can be improved, and here's how it could work better. And I think there's room for both approaches.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm wondering if we have other questions, particularly around trauma and the connection to your work that we'd like to get to. Maybe you could respond to and we could post on our website.
We'd love to.
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's great. Matt and Dan, thank you so very much for joining us today. And everybody who attended, we really appreciate it. Please join us on December 18th for our next conversation on adolescence, poverty, and homelessness. Matt and Dan, have a great rest of the day. Thank you again.
Thank you.